Welcome, my friends, to another journey into the depths of history. Tonight, we're not just exploring the past. We're stepping into a time when the very fabric of existence was torn asunder by an unseen terror. Picture France, the largest, most populous kingdom in 14th century Europe, vibrant and bustling, yet teetering on the edge of an abyss. In this immersive documentary, we will unravel the grim saga of the Black Death's invasion of France, from the moment that cursed ship docked in Marseille to the horrific societal collapse that followed and the desperate search for answers and scapegoats that turned neighbors into enemies. So, settle in, dim the lights, perhaps grab a warm drink. And, as always, if you find yourself captivated by this ancient drama, a like, a comment, or a share truly helps our channel grow. Now, let us begin and prepare to witness a chapter of human resilience, fear, and profound change. Imagine, if you will, the bustling heart of 14th century Europe, a land of vibrant markets, soaring cathedrals, and the incessant hum of human endeavor. This was France, a kingdom at the very zenith of its medieval power and population, home to somewhere between 16 and 20 million souls. It was a land deeply embroiled in the epic struggle of the 100 Years' War, a conflict that had already drained its coffers and tested its resolve. King Philip VI, reeling from the recent defeat at Crécy, had just convened the Estates General, desperately seeking funds to continue the fight. The air was thick with political tension, economic strain, and the pervasive anxieties of a kingdom at war. Yet, even as they grappled with these immense burdens, an unseen, far more sinister enemy was already making its relentless journey across the seas. The year is 1347. November. The Mediterranean, a vital artery of trade and communication, unwittingly becomes a conduit for an unimaginable horror. A ship laden with goods, and perhaps with unwitting passengers clinging to life by a thread, sails into the bustling port of Marseille. It's a vessel that carries not just cargo, but a grim passenger, a silent, microscopic harbinger of death, the likes of which humanity had never before witnessed. This was the Black Death, a bubonic plague that had already cut a swathe of devastation through distant Crimea and across the sun-drenched shores of Italy. Now it had arrived in France. The tale of its arrival in Marseille is chilling in its simplicity, a stark reminder of how interconnected the world, even in its medieval iteration, truly was. Imagine the scene. A Genoese plague ship, forced to leave its home port, perhaps due to the burgeoning pestilence there, seeks refuge or trade in Marseille. It docks, its crew disembarks, and with them, the unseen enemy spills onto French soil. The port, a vibrant hub of international commerce, becomes ground zero. From this single point of entry, the plague, a merciless, indiscriminate killer, begins its relentless march. Marseille, a vital trade center, was tragically well-positioned to become a launching pad for the plague's expansion. The insidious illness, with its horrifying speed and brutal efficiency, quickly took root along the Mediterranean coast. From there, it followed the natural pathways of human interaction, seeping inwards along the great Rhone River, a lifeline for trade and travel. Imagine the unsuspecting river barges carrying goods, people, and now, the deadly contagion, deeper and deeper into the French hinterland. The mortality rate of this plague was staggering, almost unimaginable to us today. Experts estimate that 70 to 80% of those infected would succumb. This wasn't just a severe illness, it was a near-certain death sentence. In the initial 4 years of its rampage across Europe, an estimated 20 million souls were lost. And France, with its enormous population, was particularly vulnerable. Now, while we often speak of the Black Death as a single entity, it's important to understand that it manifested in different, equally terrifying forms. The primary culprit was the bubonic plague, characterized by the gruesome, swollen lymph nodes, or buboes, that gave the disease its name. But there were also other, even more rapid and horrific variations, the septicemic plague, which overwhelmed the bloodstream, and the pneumonic plague, which attacked the lungs, turning breath into a deadly cough, spreading the contagion through the very air people breathed. The descriptions from those who lived through it are harrowing, offering us a window into a world transformed by fear and death. Consider Louis Halogen, writing from Avignon, the seat of the papacy at the time. He reported the plague's arrival in December of 1347, detailing how that same ill-fated Genoese ship, after infecting Marseille, was then forced to continue its journey, spreading pestilence along the entire southern French coast, from Marseille westward towards Toulouse and northward towards Avignon itself. Avignon, a city of immense spiritual and political significance, was not spared. The Pope, Clement VI, finding himself caught in the heart of this unfolding catastrophe, resorted to the most desperate measures. He ordered religious processions, grand spectacles of prayer and penance, hoping to appease what the Church interpreted as God's wrath, a divine punishment for the sins of humanity. Imagine the scenes: thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, processing through the streets, fervent in their pleas, yet unknowingly gathering in dense crowds, providing fertile ground for the plague to spread even further. Even the highest authority on earth was not immune to fear or to the grim realities of the disease. The Pope's physician, Guy de Chauliac, a man of considerable medical knowledge for his time, advised His Holiness to retreat, to seek refuge from the plague in a more isolated location. Clement VI, heeding this counsel, took shelter in Ital-sur-Rhône, a move that undoubtedly saved his life, while his flock suffered and perished in the streets of Avignon. The Black Death's progress through southern France was swift and unforgiving. By January of 1348, it had reached Carcassonne, a fortified city whose mighty walls offered no defense against this invisible enemy. By April, Toulouse, another major urban center, was under siege. Bordeaux, a vital port in its own right, confirmed the plague's presence by June, though it's highly probable it had been there since March. We even know that a ship carrying pilgrims from Bordeaux inadvertently carried the plague further, ferrying it across the Bay of Biscay to Santiago de Compostela in Spain, a holy site that became, for many, a place of ultimate demise. And by April of 1348, the ancient city of Lyon, strategically positioned at the confluence of the Rhône and Saône rivers, found itself engulfed by the same relentless tide of sickness. From Lyon, the plague then surged rapidly across the verdant landscapes of Burgundy. The sheer, terrifying efficiency of the plague's spread is underscored by records from the small Burgundian village of Givry. Within a mere 3-month span, from August to November of 1348, half of its entire population was wiped out. Half! Imagine the profound silence that would descend upon such a place, the sudden void left in its wake, the absence of laughter, of children's cries, of the familiar rhythms of daily life. As the grim passenger moved northward, it eventually set its sights on the grandest prize of all, Paris. At this time, Paris was not just the capital of France, but arguably the largest city in all of Europe, a sprawling metropolis home to anywhere between 80,000 and 200,000 people. The Black Death's arrival in Paris has been vividly documented in the chronicle of the Carmelite monk, Jean de Venette, who resided at the Saint Denis Abbey, just outside the city walls. De Venette's account paints a horrifying picture of a city under siege by death. He recorded the plague's arrival in Roissy, near Gonesse, in June of 1348. His writings speak of 16,000 souls lost in Saint Denis alone, and a chilling daily toll of 800 deaths in Paris itself during November and December of that year. Imagine the logistical nightmare of dealing with such overwhelming numbers of dead. De Venette recounts daily transports, often carrying up to 500 bodies to mass burial sites, a grim procession that became a constant, terrifying feature of Parisian life. The Hôtel Dieu, Paris's venerable hospital, staffed by devoted nuns, saw its ranks dwindle as these courageous women, ministering to the sick and dying, perished alongside them. Their unwavering compassion, tragically, often sealed their own fate. The plague's relentless advance continued into northern France. In Normandy, records from the Normandy Nova Chronica confirm its presence in Rouen by the Feast of John the Baptist, June 24th, 1348. In this region, the devastation was so profound that even in country villages, burying the dead became an impossible task. Imagine the horror of seeing unburied corpses, a constant reminder of the plague's insatiable hunger. And then, a chilling custom emerged. Each village gripped by the plague would fly a black flag, a stark and somber warning to any approaching travelers, a silent testament to the death that reigned within. Further north, in Tournai, the abbot Gilles Lemuisis chronicled the plague's arrival in August of 1349, describing its tenure until November. In Tournai, the Black Death didn't just claim lives, it sparked a profound religious reformation. Interpreted as divine retribution for humanity's sins, the authorities enacted strict regulations, banning what they deemed sinful activities like gambling. Even cohabiting couples, unmarried, were forced to either separate or wed immediately, a desperate attempt to appease a seemingly wrathful God. Due to the sheer size of France, the plague's spread wasn't uniform. While some areas were ravaged quickly, others were spared, at least for a time. The plague traveled more slowly by land than by sea. Brittany and Auvergne, for example, were not reached until 1349. In some remote, isolated parts of the kingdom remained untouched until 1351. The very last corner of France to finally be reached by the Black Death was Tonnerre, which did not experience its devastating arrival until 1352. The grim passenger, having traversed the entirety of this great kingdom, finally completed its journey. The grim passenger had disembarked, its shadow now stretching across the heart of France. From the bustling port of Marseille, where that ill-fated Genoese ship first unloaded its deadly cargo, the plague began its relentless march. It wasn't a sudden explosion across the entire kingdom, but a creeping, insidious tide, flowing along the veins of trade and travel, touching first the sun-drenched shores of the Mediterranean, then seeping inland, northwards. Imagine, if you will, the France of the mid-14th century, a land already weary from the gnawing conflict of the 100 Years' War with England. The devastating loss at the Battle of Crécy just a year prior, in 1346, still echoed in the hearts of its people. King Philip VI, straining to fund this endless war, had just convened the Estates General in November of that very year, seeking desperate measures to finance the struggle. Taxes, levies, the economic sinews of the kingdom already taut. And into this already fragile tapestry, the plague arrived. France at this time was a colossus in Europe. Its population, estimated between 16 to 20 million souls, was the largest on the continent, and its cities, though not as numerous as Italy's, were vibrant hubs of life and commerce. Paris, above all, stood as a glittering jewel, a sprawling metropolis whose fate would soon become a chilling testament to the Black Death's power. The initial wave, as Louis Halogen, a contemporary observer in Avignon, described, emanated from that cursed Genoese ship. After being driven from its home port, it found its way to Marseille, leaving a trail of sickness in its wake. The pestilence then began to follow the established pathways of human interaction, west towards Toulouse, northwards along the Rhone, reaching Avignon by early 1348. Avignon, a city of immense spiritual significance, served as the residence of Pope Clement VI during the Western Schism. Here, amidst the growing horror, the Church found itself grappling with a divine wrath it could not comprehend. Religious processions, solemn and desperate, filled the streets, intended to appease an angry God. The Pope, advised by his astute physician, Guy de Chauliac, wisely retreated to Ital-sur-Rhône, a move that would ultimately save his life. But for the ordinary people of Avignon, there was no escape. The plague spread like wildfire, its pace accelerating with the warmer months. While winter offered a brief, deceptive respite, the spring and summer of 1348 would unleash a horror unimaginable. In April, the Black Death reached Lyon, another crucial crossroads of trade and humanity. From there, it surged into Burgundy, leaving devastation in its wake. We have a stark record from the village of Givry, where between August and November of 1348, a chilling 50% of its population simply ceased to exist. Gone in a few short months. But it was in Paris, the beating heart of France, that the plague's true, terrifying potential was unleashed. Jean de Venette, a Carmelite monk residing at the St. Denis Abbey just outside the city, left us a harrowing chronicle. Paris, then, was the largest city in Europe, with its population hovering somewhere between 80,000 and 200,000 souls. Imagine that teeming mass of humanity, packed into narrow, winding streets, their lives interwoven in an intricate dance of commerce, faith, and daily struggle. According to de Venette, the plague arrived in the Parisian region in June 1348, making its grim presence felt first in Roissy, near Gonesse. But it was in the colder months, November and December of that year, that the city truly began to choke under its grip. De Venette claims a staggering 16,000 people died in St. Denis alone. And in Paris itself, 800 souls perished each day. 800 people, every single day. Think of what that means. The sheer volume of death overwhelmed every aspect of daily life. The living could barely keep pace with the dying. We hear of daily transports of up to 500 dead bodies, carted through the ravaged streets to mass burial sites. The Hôtel Dieu, Paris's primary hospital, staffed by devoted nuns, saw its numbers dwindle rapidly. These brave women, ministering to the sick, fell alongside them, their selfless devotion costing them their very lives. The city became a vast, open grave, its air thick with the stench of death and the despair of the living. The plague didn't stop at Paris. It spread to Rouen in Normandy by the feast of John the Baptist, June 24th, 1348. Here, the horror was so profound that in country villages, the dead could not even be buried. Each village touched by the pestilence, in a macabre warning to any approaching travelers, would hoist a black flag, a silent, grim signal of death. Further north, the Abbot Gilles Limuisis of Tournai chronicled the plague's arrival in August 1349, lasting until November. Here, the sheer terror of the disease prompted a profound, if desperate, religious reformation. Believing the plague to be God's direct punishment for humanity's sins, authorities imposed strict regulations. Gambling was banned. Couples living together without being married were given a stark choice: separate immediately or marry at once. The fear of divine retribution was as palpable as the fear of the disease itself. The vastness of France meant the plague's spread wasn't uniform. While coastal areas and major trade routes were hit first and hardest, some more remote regions, particularly Brittany and Auvergne, weren't touched until 1349. Other isolated pockets held out even longer, until 1351. The very last part of France to finally succumb to the Black Death was Tonnerre, which did not experience the plague until 1352. The Black Death, a slow-motion catastrophe, unfolded over years across the kingdom, leaving no corner untouched, eventually claiming roughly 50,000 lives in Paris alone, annihilating half of its population. The scale of this human toll is almost beyond comprehension. A city of corpses indeed. As the plague unfurled its dark wings across the vast, intricate tapestry of France, leaving a trail of death and despair in its wake, something even more insidious began to fester in the hearts and minds of the survivors. Fear, that primal, raw emotion, morphed into a terrifying paranoia, turning neighbor against neighbor and whispers of illness into shouts of accusation. This was the era when panic turned deadly, when the unseen enemy in the air transformed into a visible scapegoat, and when the very fabric of society began to unravel under the strain of suspicion and terror. Imagine, if you will, the scene in Avignon. Louis Halogen, a meticulous observer of those harrowing times, penned his account from within the besieged city. He described how, by April of 1348, as the death toll mounted and the stench of decay hung heavy in the air, the desperate need to understand, to blame, began to consume the populace. The plague, in its terrifying randomness, defied all rational explanation. How could such a swift, agonizing death strike down the young and the old, the pious and the sinner, with seemingly no discernible pattern? In the absence of medical understanding, a more ancient and terrifying narrative took root: divine punishment. The Church, in its wisdom, or perhaps its desperation, had already framed the plague as God's wrath, a scourge visited upon humanity for its sins. Pope Clement VI himself, ensconced in his Avignon palace, perhaps even while his physician Gay de Chauliac was urging him to seek refuge from the very air they breathed, organized grand religious processions. Imagine the spectacle: long lines of people, their faces etched with fear and desperation, moving slowly through the plague-ridden streets, chanting prayers, carrying relics, all hoping to appease an angry God and halt the relentless march of death. It was a poignant display of faith born from unimaginable terror, a collective plea for mercy in a world that offered none. But divine judgment, while offering a theological framework, didn't satisfy the immediate, visceral need for an earthly explanation, for someone or something to hold accountable. And so, in the fertile ground of fear and ignorance, a truly horrific rumor began to sprout and spread like wildfire. The plague was not a natural occurrence, not a punishment from God alone, but the result of a deliberate, malicious act. Someone, it was whispered, was poisoning the wells. Someone was intent on exterminating Christendom. At first, these accusations were flung indiscriminately. Picture the scene: a solitary traveler, perhaps a weary pilgrim on their way to a distant shrine, or a destitute beggar seeking alms, stopping at a village well. Their presence, their difference, their simple act of drawing water could be enough to ignite suspicion. Or consider the invalid, already weakened by illness, perhaps carrying a small pouch of herbal remedies. In a world gripped by paranoia, this innocent powder could easily be mistaken for a deadly poison. The very act of being different, of being an outsider, became a death sentence. Halogen himself reported that in Avignon, as early as April 1348, people were indeed being executed for this supposed crime of well poisoning. Think about that for a moment. In a city already overflowing with the dead and dying, where the very air was thick with grief, the authorities were diverting their dwindling resources to apprehend, torture, and execute individuals based on nothing more than fear-fueled rumor. This wasn't justice. It was an act of collective madness, a desperate attempt to grasp at some semblance of control in a world that had spiraled utterly out of control. From Avignon, these terrifying whispers spread. André Benezite, the secretary to the mayor of Narbonne, penned a chilling letter to the mayor of Girona in Catalonia, relaying a horrifying account. He described how, in the southern French towns of Narbonne, Carcassonne, and Grasse, towns already reeling from the plague's initial assault, numerous beggars have been arrested, subjected to unspeakable torture, and then executed. Their alleged crime? Poisoning the wells. The sheer speed and ferocity with which these accusations took hold, and the brutal efficiency with which they were acted upon, speaks volumes about the level of panic that gripped France. But the indiscriminate fear, the random accusations, soon found a more specific and tragically familiar target: the Jewish population. For centuries, Jewish communities across Europe had often been seen as outsiders, convenient scapegoats for societal ills. Despite a relatively small Jewish presence in France at this time, largely due to a previous ban by King Louis IX, the old prejudices quickly resurfaced. The insidious logic took hold. If someone was poisoning the wells, And if those someones were intent on harming Christendom, then who better to accuse than those who were already marginalized, already considered other? Pope Clement VI, to his immense credit, recognized the grave injustice unfolding. On July 5th, and again on September 26th of that same year, he issued forceful condemnations of the persecution of Jews during the Black Death. He unequivocally declared that the plague was a divine punishment, a judgment from God himself, and that to accuse the Jews of causing it was not only baseless but also deeply sinful. He bravely proclaimed that the Jewish people were under his direct protection. However, even papal authority, powerful as it was, struggled against the overwhelming tide of fear and prejudice. While direct documentation of widespread Jewish massacres in France itself during this specific period is somewhat scarcer than in other regions, the impact of these well-poisoning rumors was undeniably felt. The accusations emanating from France, for instance, fueled horrific persecutions and mass executions in the neighboring Duchy of Savoy. And the tragic echoes of these lies resonated with devastating force across the Holy Roman Empire, where larger Jewish communities faced annihilation in massacres born from the very same accusations. Even within France, despite the papal condemnations, the wave of anti-Jewish sentiment found its violent expression. April and May of 1348, as the Black Death raged at its peak, saw a series of horrifying anti-Jewish riots. Imagine the terror. The massacre of at least 40 Jews in Toulon, a bustling port city in Provence. The complete annihilation of the Jewish community at La Baume de Sisteron, another town in Provence. Further communities, vibrant hubs of culture and commerce, were wiped out at Narbonne and Carcassonne, both in southern France, the very regions where the initial accusations of well poisoning had first taken hold. These were not isolated incidents. They were the terrifying manifestation of a society pushed to its breaking point, where the instinct for self-preservation mutated into a murderous xenophobia. The plague wasn't just killing bodies. It was poisoning souls, turning neighbor against neighbor, and exposing the darkest prejudices hidden beneath the thin veneer of civility. The whispers of poison and prayers had become a horrifying symphony of chaos, revealing the profound vulnerability of human society when confronted by an enemy it could neither comprehend nor control. The relentless tide of death had swept over France, leaving devastation in its wake, but the story doesn't end with the last burial cart. The Black Death was more than a biological event. It was a societal earthquake, shattering the foundations of a kingdom already under immense strain. As the plague's grip began to loosen, albeit temporarily, France was forced to confront a world irrevocably altered. Imagine, if you will, the Kingdom of France in the mid-14th century, a land of vibrant culture, burgeoning cities, and a population that dwarfed most of its European neighbors. But beneath this veneer of prosperity, a brutal conflict simmered and occasionally boiled over: the 100 Years' War. This was not a minor skirmish, but a grinding, protracted struggle against England, a war that had bled the French treasury dry and left its people weary. Just a year before the plague's arrival, in 1346, France had suffered a crushing defeat at the Battle of Crécy, a battle that showcased the deadly efficiency of English longbowmen against the famed French chivalry. The financial burden of this war was so immense that King Philip VI had been forced to convene the Estates General in November 1347, just as the plague was docking in Marseille, to beg for emergency funds, a war subsidy that regions would pay through sales or hearth taxes. This was the fragile state of France when the Black Death struck. A nation of perhaps 16 to 20 million souls, the largest population in Europe, relatively urbanized, much like Italy. It was a demographic boon that would soon become a tragic vulnerability. When that Genoese plague ship, fresh from the devastation it had wrought in Italy, arrived in Marseille in November of 1347, it wasn't just bringing disease, it was lighting a fuse. Marseille, a vital hub of Mediterranean trade, became the unwitting conduit, channeling the pestilence not only across southern France, but also further into Western Europe. The initial spread, as we discussed, followed the trade routes up the Rhone River along the Mediterranean coast. But the Black Death wasn't a fleeting horror, it was a lingering nightmare. Its mortality rate was shockingly high, estimated between 70 to 80%, a terrifying number that suggests just how deadly this unseen enemy was. And while the cold of winter might offer a slight reprieve, the warmer months saw the plague surge with renewed, devastating ferocity. In just the first 4 years of its European rampage, an estimated 20 million people perished. 20 million. Try to wrap your mind around that figure. The primary form, of course, was the bubonic plague, characterized by the horrific swellings, the buboes. But it also manifested in other, equally terrifying ways. Septicemic plague, poisoning the very bloodstream, and pneumonic plague, infecting the lungs and turning a cough into a death sentence, capable of spreading directly from person to person. These are the monsters unleashed upon a society already teetering on the edge. As the plague migrated from south to north, the fabric of daily life began to unravel. Consider the accounts from Avignon, where Pope Clement VI resided during the Western Schism. Louis Halogen, an observer there, reported the arrival of the plague in December 1347. This wasn't a silent killer. It announced its presence with a horrifying spectacle. The Pope, advised by his physician Gay de Chauliac, famously sequestered himself, surviving the outbreak while the city around him dissolved into chaos. But even the Supreme Pontiff, in his spiritual and worldly authority, could offer little practical solace against a foe that defied understanding. His solution, echoing the sentiment of the age, was to arrange elaborate religious processions, a desperate plea to an angry God, who the Church believed was punishing humanity for its sins. This belief of divine wrath would have profound and often terrifying consequences. The plague's journey through southwest France, though less documented than Avignon, was equally grim. Carcassonne in January 1348, Toulouse by April, Bordeaux by March, if not earlier. It was from Bordeaux, a port bustling with pilgrims, that the plague is said to have journeyed to Santiago de Compostela in Spain, a stark reminder that faith, travel, and devotion, once symbols of hope and connection, had become vectors of death. By April 1348, Lyon, a critical crossroads, had fallen victim. From Lyon, the plague marched north, swallowing Burgundy whole. The village of Givry, a microcosm of the larger catastrophe, saw half its population wiped out between August and November of 1348. Half. Imagine the silence that would descend upon such a place, the empty homes, the fields left untended. And then Paris, the largest city in Europe, a bustling metropolis of perhaps 80,000 to 200,000 souls, a center of learning, commerce, and royal power. The Carmelite Jean d'Avenant, residing at the St. Denis Abbey just outside Paris, left us with harrowing accounts. He documented the plague's arrival near Gonesse in June 1348. His chronicle speaks of 16,000 dead in St. Denis and a horrifying 800 people perishing each day in Paris during November and December of that year. The sheer scale of death was unimaginable, leading to daily transports of up to 500 bodies to mass burial sites. The Hôtel Dieu, Paris's main hospital, staffed by courageous nuns who died alongside the sick they tended, became a funnel for the endless procession of the dead. These nuns, dedicating their lives to care, became martyrs in all but name, their dwindling numbers a grim barometer of the plague's relentless advance. The Normandy Nova Chronica records the plague reaching Rouen in Normandy by June 24, 1348. Here, in the countryside, the devastation was so complete that burying the dead became impossible. Villages once vibrant now flew a black flag, a stark and chilling warning to any approaching traveler. Turn back. Death reigns here. Further north, in Tournai, the abbot Gilles Lemuisis chronicled the plague's arrival in August 1349, lasting until November. In Tournai, The plague wasn't just a physical threat. It became a catalyst for a radical religious reformation. Believed to be divine punishment, authorities banned gambling and other perceived sins, forcing unmarried couples to separate or marry immediately. The terror of the plague was reshaping moral codes, driving people to desperate measures in a desperate attempt to appease a wrathful God. But France, vast and sprawling, was not conquered uniformly. The plague, traveling slower by land than by sea, left certain regions untouched for longer. Brittany and Auvergne weren't reached until 1349, and some remote parts held out until 1351. Tonnerre, in a cruel twist of fate, was one of the last bastions, finally succumbing in 1352. The Black Death was a siege that lasted for years, picking off victims one region at a time. When the dust began to settle, France was a profoundly different kingdom. King Philip VI, in a desperate attempt to understand and combat the unseen enemy, commissioned the University of Paris to produce the pioneering work, the Compendium de Epidemia. This document, along with the Paris Concilium, represented an early, albeit often flawed, attempt at scientific inquiry in the face of overwhelming catastrophe. It was a sign that even amidst the horror, there was a glimmer of human intellect striving for answers. But the immediate consequences were far more immediate and brutal. The war's subsidy, so urgently requested in 1347, became almost impossible to collect. With fewer hands to work the land, fewer merchants to trade, and fewer people to tax, the kingdom's financial woes deepened. Ironically, the plague spread to England by mid-1349, brought a temporary pause in the 100 Years' War. Both kingdoms were too busy burying their dead to fight each other. Yet perhaps one of the most disturbing consequences of the plague was the way it twisted human nature. Panic, fear, and a desperate need for answers led to the search for scapegoats. Whispers began to spread, insidious and deadly, that the wells were being poisoned, that someone was deliberately spreading the plague to exterminate Christendom. At first, these accusations were broad, aimed at anyone different or suspicious. Travelers, pilgrims, beggars, invalids, or anyone found with an unfamiliar powder. Louis Haligen in Avignon reported executions for well poisoning in April 1348. André Benezite, a secretary in Narbonne, wrote to the mayor of Girona that beggars were arrested, tortured, and executed in Narbonne, Carcassonne, and Grasse. But these vague suspicions soon coalesced into a focused, horrific accusation: the Jews. Despite a relatively small Jewish population in France at the time, largely due to King Louis IX's earlier banishment, the seeds of suspicion, once sown, grew quickly into a harvest of hatred. Pope Clement VI, to his credit, issued condemnations of these Jewish persecutions, declaring the plague to be God's punishment and stating that accusing the Jews was sinful. He placed them under his protection. However, the Pope's words, while significant, could not entirely quell the mob mentality. While widespread massacres might have been less prevalent in France itself compared to the Holy Roman Empire, where Jewish communities were larger, the rumors originating in France fueled horrific events. There were documented anti-Jewish riots and massacres. At least 40 Jews murdered in Toulon, the community at La Baume, de Sisteron wiped out, and similar fates for communities in Narbonne and Carcassonne, all in Provence. The panic and paranoia unleashed by the Black Death exposed a dark vein of bigotry and cruelty that ran through medieval society. The Black Death wasn't a one-time event, a single wave that crashed and receded forever. Bubonic plague would return, again and again, like a malevolent specter, though thankfully with fewer fatalities and subsequent outbreaks. These recurrences would continue to shape life in France for centuries, until the very last gasp of the plague in the Great Plague of Marseille in 1720, an event so devastating that the Spanish erected a cordon, and the French army surrounded Provence with a third of its infantry and a quarter of its cavalry, desperate to contain the horror. France, a kingdom already tested by war and internal strife, emerged from the initial onslaught of the Black Death, irrevocably changed. Its population decimated, its economy reeling, its social fabric stretched thin. The medieval world, as it had been known, was slowly but surely dying alongside its inhabitants. The plague had not merely taken lives. It had reshaped a kingdom, forcing it to confront its vulnerabilities, its prejudices, and the terrifying fragility of human existence. The echoes of that suffering, of that transformation, would reverberate for centuries, setting the stage for a new France to rise from the ashes of devastation. And so, we bring our long, haunting journey through the Black Death in France to a close. We've witnessed the unimaginable, the sheer scale of human suffering, and the profound ways in which a single plague could reshape an entire continent, a civilization, and the very spirit of its people. The echoes of those brutal years still resonate, reminding us of fragility, resilience, and the eternal human struggle against the unknown. I hope this deep dive has offered you new perspectives, perhaps even some calming reflections amidst the storm of history. If you found value in our time together, please consider giving us a like, sharing your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribing to Vibing History for more forgotten tales. What other ancient mysteries or brutal chapters would you like us to explore next? Until our next journey into the past, take care and keep vibing with history.